In the shadow of an impending Soviet onslaught, Berlin in 1945 was a city on the brink. As the final chapters of World War II were being written, the residents of Berlin braced for impact. Their city already scarred by war and their spirits tested by the siege of uncertainty. The Siege of Spirits. As 1945 dawned over Berlin, the city was a shadow of its former self, a stark landscape punctuated by the rubble of relentless bombings and the anticipation of the Soviet Red Army's final assault. The psychological state of its residents was a complex tapestry woven with threads of fear, defiance, dark humor, and an unyielding resilience born from the depths of human despair. The siege on the spirits of Berliners was not just a matter of physical survival, but a battle for psychological endurance. The city, once the heart of Nazi Germany, was now a fortress preparing for its inevitable fall. Amidst this, the inhabitants found themselves oscillating between moments of grim acceptance and bursts of survivalist energy, their daily lives a testament to the human capacity to adapt under the most dire circumstances. The air raids had become a routine of horror, where the night skies would light up with the fireworks of destruction. In response, Berliners developed a grim sense of humor, a mechanism to cope with the uncopable. Jokes made in the darkest hours reflected a spirit that refused to be entirely quenched, even as the sound of air raid sirens became the city's haunting lullaby. One anecdote that captured the essence of this dark humor involved a Berliner joking about the efficiency of the air raids, noting that they no longer needed alarm clocks to wake up in the morning or night lights to find their way in the dark. Another quip circulating the city was about the new Berlin sky, humorously referring to the ever-present smoke and fire from bombings as a grim replacement for the stars. But it wasn't just humor that kept the spirit of Berlin alive. It was also an inherent resilience and a strange sense of solidarity that emerged among the residents. Despite the National Socialist regime's iron grip, the common suffering led to an unspoken bond between neighbors, friends, and even strangers. This solidarity was visible in the shared efforts to clear rubble from the streets, distribute scant food supplies, and support one another during the relentless air raids. In bomb shelters and bunkers, where fear and hope were constant companions, stories of extraordinary human kindness emerged. People shared their last pieces of bread, whispered words of comfort, and protected each other against the cold and the chaos outside. These underground havens became microcosms of a society clinging to the threads of humanity amidst the inhumanity of war. Children, too, displayed a resilience that belied their years. They played amidst the ruins, their games incorporating the reality of their world, air raids, soldiers, and rubble. Their ability to find moments of joy and laughter amidst devastation was a poignant reminder of the indomitable human spirit. Yet, as the Soviet forces drew closer, a palpable sense of doom began to settle over the city. Rumors and fear of what the Soviet occupation would entail ran rampant. Stories of atrocities committed on the Eastern Front fueled a terror of retribution. In response, some Berliners prepared for the worst, hiding their daughters and planning for a last stand. Others clung to a hope that surrender would bring an end to their suffering, that the kindness within humanity would prevail over vengeance. Despite the overwhelming sense of despair, there was a peculiar optimism among some Berliners. Propaganda from Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda promised the arrival of Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons, that would turn the tide of the war. Even as the Red Army encircled the city, a few clung to the belief in a miraculous German victory, a testament to the power of hope, or perhaps desperation, in the darkest times. As the final Soviet attack loomed, Berliners lived in a suspended reality, caught between the remnants of a collapsing Reich and the uncertain promise of a future. The siege of spirits in Berlin was not just a battle against the external enemy, but an internal struggle for hope, meaning, and survival in the face of overwhelming odds. The rhythms of war and silence. In the final months before the Soviet encirclement, Berlin oscillated between two extremes, the deafening chaos of air raids and an eerie, almost surreal calm. This rhythm, a relentless cycle of noise and silence, dictated the life of every Berliner, shaping their existence into a series of disrupted moments and haunted pauses. The air raids, an almost daily ordeal by early 1945, brought life in the city to a standstill. Sirens would wail, a foreboding prelude that sent civilians scrambling for cover in the nearest shelter or bunker. The sound of approaching bombers was the overture to chaos, a terrifying crescendo that climaxed as the city was engulfed in explosions. Buildings that had withstood previous attacks crumbled. Windows shattered, streets were torn open, and fires blazed uncontrollably, painting the night sky with the colors of war. For Berliners, these raids were a time of communal fear and anticipation. Huddled in overcrowded shelters, they shared not only the physical space, but their anxieties and darkest fears. The din of the outside world was a constant reminder of their vulnerability, a soundtrack to their collective nightmare. Yet, within these confines, there was a camaraderie born of shared suffering, a silent acknowledgement that they were all in this together, regardless of age, status, or ideology. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos would cease. The bombers would depart, leaving behind a city shrouded in smoke and silence. This silence was as profound as the noise that preceded it, a heavy, oppressive calm that weighed on the spirits of those who emerged from their shelters. It was in these moments that the full extent of the destruction became apparent. Streets were littered with debris, landmarks reduced to rubble, and the air filled with the acrid smell of fire and death. The calm after the raids was a time for reflection, for assessing the damage and counting the losses. It was also a time for action. Berliners would begin the slow Sisyphean task of clearing the wreckage, salvaging what they could, and preparing for the inevitable next attack. Amidst this destruction, life attempted to regain some semblance of normalcy. Shops tried to reopen, children went back to playing in the streets, and adults returned to their tasks, all the while keeping an ear tuned for the next siren call. This rhythm of war and silence deeply disrupted daily life. The constant threat of air raids meant that no plan could be certain, no routine fixed. Meals were hurried, sleep was snatched in brief interludes, and every goodbye could be the last. Yet, Berliners adapted with remarkable resilience. They learned to live in the moment, to cherish the calm as a precious respite, and to face the chaos with a stoic determination. The contrast between war and silence also played out in the psychological landscape of the city's inhabitants. The noise of the raids heightened senses, adrenalized emotions, and forged memories of terror that would last a lifetime. The silence, in contrast, offered a space for introspection, mourning, and sometimes a fragile hope. It was in these quiet moments that the human spirit showed its capacity for hope and recovery, even in the face of overwhelming despair. Moreover, the silence allowed for the resurgence of natural sounds previously drowned out by the cacophony of war. Birds chirping, the wind rustling through damaged trees, the distant laughter of children. These sounds, though faint, served as reminders that life, albeit battered and bruised, persisted amidst the ruins. The rhythm of war and silence also underscored the dual reality Berliners lived in. In moments of calm, the city could almost seem like its former self, with people going about their business, trying to maintain a semblance of normality. But the scars of war, visible in every bombed-out building and every makeshift grave, were a constant reminder of the temporary nature of this peace. Shadows in ruins, the fight for survival. In the besieged city of Berlin, as the final Soviet offensive drew ever closer, the struggle for the bare necessities of life became an all-consuming reality for its inhabitants. Amidst the ruins of a once thriving metropolis, Berliners faced a daily battle for survival. with the scarcity of food, water, and shelter defining their existence in the shadow of impending doom. The destruction wrought by continuous air raids and the encroaching front lines had decimated the city's infrastructure. Water pipes burst under the strain of bombings, leaving entire neighborhoods without access to clean water. The search for this vital resource became a daily ritual, with long queues forming at the few remaining wells or at makeshift community points where water was distributed. The sight of individuals, young and old, carrying buckets or any containers they could find, became emblematic of the city's plight. Food scarcity added another layer of desperation to the already dire situation. The agricultural heartlands of Germany were either battlegrounds or under Allied control, severely limiting the supply lines into the city. Rationing, implemented early in the war, had become stricter, with the allotted quantities barely enough to sustain life. People resorted to bartering their few remaining valuables for a loaf of bread or a handful of potatoes. Urban foraging became common, with families scouring parks and abandoned plots for anything edible, from nettles to wild berries. The markets, once bustling centers of trade, now resembled post-apocalyptic trading posts, where the currency had shifted from Reichsmarks to a barter system of goods and services. A pair of shoes might fetch a week's worth of food, while cigarettes and alcohol became precious commodities, traded not just for sustenance, but for a momentary escape from the harsh reality. Shelter, or the lack thereof, compounded the misery of Berlin's residents. The relentless bombing campaigns had left vast swaths of the city in ruins. Families found themselves homeless overnight, their belongings buried under rubble. The fortunate ones found refuge with neighbors or relatives, crowding into the remaining habitable spaces. Others took to living in the cellars of destroyed buildings, constructing makeshift homes from debris. The city's underground, including subway stations and air raid shelters, became overcrowded sanctuaries for those displaced by the war. The public spaces of Berlin, once symbols of civic pride and community, were transformed into landscapes of survival. Parks were dug up for vegetable gardens, and trees were felled for firewood. The zoo, a place of wonder and leisure before the war, became a source of meat as starvation drove people to unthinkable measures. In this environment of scarcity and struggle, the social fabric of the city began to fray. Crime rates soared as desperation drove people to theft and black market dealings. Yet amidst the chaos, there were also stories of incredible solidarity and compassion. Neighbors shared their meager rations, protected each other's children, and formed communities of mutual aid. These acts of kindness, small beacons of hope in a sea of despair, highlighted the enduring strength of the human spirit. Children, in particular, bore the brunt of the hardship. Their world, once filled with the joys of childhood, was now a landscape of hunger and fear. Many took on roles well beyond their years, scavenging for food, tending to younger siblings, or running messages for the resistance. The war robbed them of their innocence, forcing them into a maturity shaped by the struggle for survival. Underneath Berlin, life in the bunkers. As Berlin withstood the relentless onslaught from above, life beneath the city's surface unfolded in a network of bunkers and anti-aircraft towers, serving as grim sanctuaries for its beleaguered inhabitants. These subterranean refugees, designed to protect the civilian population from aerial bombardments, became microcosms of a city under siege, encapsulating the fear, resilience, and enduring spirit of Berliners facing the apocalypse of their city. The flak towers, massive concrete fortresses erected around Berlin, were among the most formidable of these shelters. Initially intended for defense against air raids and to serve as platforms for anti-aircraft guns, they also provided refuge for tens of thousands of civilians. The interiors of these towers, while offering protection, were anything but hospitable. Overcrowded to several times their intended capacity, they were mazes of concrete and steel, where space was a luxury few could afford. Inside these towers, life took on a surreal quality. The constant drone of machinery and the muffled sounds of explosions created a continuous backdrop to the lives of those huddled within. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and damp concrete, a tangible reminder of the world outside. Lighting was minimal, often reduced to a few dim bulbs or the flickering of candles, casting long shadows that danced on the walls as the towers shuddered with each nearby detonation. The psychological toll on the inhabitants was profound. The claustrophobic environment, compounded by the uncertainty of survival, fostered a climate of anxiety and despair. Yet, amidst this, there were also moments of remarkable humanity. Stories abound of strangers comforting one another, sharing their scant provisions, and offering words of hope in the darkest hours. The shared experience of adversity brought out a sense of community and solidarity among the bunker dwellers, a bond forged in the crucible of war. Children, ever adaptable, found ways to play and laugh, their innocence a stark contrast to the grim reality surrounding them. Their games, often mimicking the war outside, were a coping mechanism, a way to make sense of the chaos that had upended their lives. For their parents, these moments of joy were bittersweet reminders of the normalcy that had been lost. Sanitation and hygiene in the bunkers were significant challenges. With facilities overwhelmed by the number of refugees, the risk of disease was ever present. Water was scarce, rationed carefully among the inhabitants, and food supplies were limited to whatever could be brought in before the bombings began. The lack of privacy and the constant proximity to others tested the limits of personal endurance and civility. As the Soviet forces drew closer, the atmosphere in the bunkers became increasingly tense. Rumors and fears about what the future held circulated in hushed whispers. The prospect of the city's fall and the uncertain fate that awaited its residents hung over the bunker communities like a pall. For some, the bunkers became symbols of defiance, bastions of the will to survive against all odds. For others, they were mere waiting rooms, liminal spaces between life and death, hope and despair. The evacuation of these bunkers during moments of respite was a ritual in itself. Emerging into the light, the inhabitants were greeted by the devastation of their city, a landscape of ruins that stood as silent testament to the fury of the war. These brief forays above ground were essential for both physical and mental health, a necessary respite from the oppressive environment below. Yet the return to the bunkers was inevitable, a reluctant acceptance of the only semblance of safety that could be found. The front line at home, civilians turned soldiers. In the final stages of World War II, as the Soviet army encroached upon Berlin, the distinction between the home front and the battlefield dissolved. Civilians, caught in the maelstrom of a collapsing Third Reich, were mobilized en masse for the city's defense. This chapter explores how ordinary Berliners, from seasoned veterans to teenagers, were conscripted into a desperate and chaotic struggle, transforming the once bustling metropolis into a fortress of makeshift barricades and volunteer soldiers. The Volkssturm, or People's Storm, epitomized this last-ditch effort to defend Berlin. Established in the autumn of 1944, this national militia drew upon all able-bodied males between the ages of 16 and 60, who were not already serving in the Wehrmacht. The Volkssturm was a testament to the dire straits faced by Nazi Germany, as resources were so depleted that these civilian soldiers were often equipped with antiquated weapons if they were armed at all. Training for these new recruits was minimal, reflecting the urgency of the situation. Many were given just a few hours of instruction before being sent to man the defenses or construct barricades. These fortifications, cobbled together from vehicles, rubble, and sandbags, crisscrossed the streets of Berlin, turning residential neighborhoods into contested zones. The task of building these barriers fell not just to the Volkssturm, but to the entire civilian population, including women and children. Schools and public buildings were repurposed as makeshift fortifications, and even the iconic Tiergarten was transformed into a defensive position. The psychological impact of this mobilization was profound. For many Berliners, the act of taking up arms or building barricades was not driven by ideological fervor, but by a sense of fatalism and the instinct to survive. The reality that the front line had come to their doorstep was a stark awakening, erasing any lingering illusions about the outcome of the war. Despite the grim circumstances, there were moments of camaraderie and resilience. Neighbors who had previously shared only polite greetings now worked side by side, forging a sense of unity in the face of adversity. Yet this newfound solidarity was often overshadowed by the fear of retribution from both the advancing Soviet forces and the Nazi regime, which punished any perceived defeatism with brutal efficiency. The participation of children and teenagers in the defense efforts was particularly tragic. The Hitler Youth, once a paramilitary organization focused on indoctrination and training, became an active part of the city's defense. Armed with Panzerfausts and propelled by propaganda, these young soldiers were among the most fervent defenders of Berlin, their youthful zeal exploited in a hopeless cause. As the Soviet army closed in, the clashes within Berlin grew more intense. The Volkssturm and other civilian defenders found themselves engaged in street fighting, a form of combat for which they were woefully unprepared. The city's thoroughfares, once bustling with life, became deadly gauntlets, and its buildings, sites of refuge, were now fortresses to be defended or besieged. The last notes of hope. In the heart of a city under siege, amidst the cacophony of war and the silence of despair, the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra held its final performance. This event, occurring just days before the city's fall, stands as a poignant testament to the enduring spirit of culture and humanity in the face of destruction. It was a moment of profound defiance, a refusal to let the soul of the city be crushed by the approaching storm. This chapter delves into the story of that night, capturing the essence of hope and the symbolic end of an era for Berlin and its inhabitants. As the Soviet forces encircled Berlin, the city's infrastructure crumbled under the relentless barrage. Amidst this chaos, a decision was made to hold one last concert, a gesture of resilience and a farewell to the semblance of normalcy that had long since faded. The chosen repertoire was Wagner's Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods, a piece resonating with themes of downfall and renewal, mirroring the fate of the city itself. The venue, severely damaged by bombings, could barely accommodate the event. Without electricity, the hall was lit by candles, casting long shadows on the walls and illuminating the faces of the attendees with a flickering glow. The cold of the unheated building was palpable, yet those who gathered did so without complaint, wearing their coats and huddling together for warmth. This congregation was a microcosm of Berlin's society at the time. Civilians, soldiers on leave, party officials, and foreign diplomats, all seeking a momentary escape from the grim reality outside. The performance was more than just a musical event. It was an act of collective defiance and a profound statement of cultural identity. As the orchestra played, the music filled the hall, transcending the barriers of fear and uncertainty that had closed in on the city. For those in attendance, the concert offered a temporary refuge, a space where the beauty of art challenged the ugliness of war. The poignant melodies served as a reminder of what was at stake, not just in Berlin, but in the very concept of civilization itself. Conducting the orchestra was Wilhelm Furtwängler, a figure who had navigated the treacherous waters of artistic integrity and compromise throughout the Nazi regime. His decision to lead this final performance was fraught with symbolism, marking the end of an era for German culture under the Third Reich. The choice of Götterdämmerung was particularly significant, as its themes of destruction and the fall of gods echoed the imminent collapse of Berlin and the Nazi regime. The performance itself was a feat of endurance. The musicians, many of whom were dealing with their own personal tragedies and hardships, played with a passion and intensity that belied their circumstances. The strains of Wagner's opera, with its epic scope and tragic beauty, filled the hall, offering a cathartic experience for both performers and audience. It was a moment of sublime artistry, a testament to the power of music to convey hope and despair, triumph and defeat.